The city of Seoul looked like a sea of glowing jewels from the 50th floor, but inside the penthouse, the air was as cold as a grave. Lee Do-hyun sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of stone. Most people called him a boss, but his enemies called him the ghost. He moved through the world of crime without leaving a trace, and he had no room in his life for feelings or memories. To him, the past was a house that had burned down a long time ago. On the corner of his desk sat a stack of folders. They contained the names of men who had crossed him and the debts that needed to be paid. Do-hyun didn't use a pen to sign these papers. He used a heavy, silver ring that left a deep mark in the paper, a sign of his absolute power. His suit was black, his shirt was crisp white, and his eyes were like shards of glass. He was a man who lived by rules and silence. However, there was one thing in the room that didn't fit the life of a mafia boss. In the far corner of the large office, tucked away in the deep shadows of a bookshelf, sat a small girl named Da-eun. She was no more than 6 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress that looked out of place against the expensive leather furniture. She was the penthouse ghost. No one knew exactly where she came from. The story among the guards was that Do-hyun had taken her from a failing orphanage as a debt payment, but the truth was more mysterious. Da-eun never spoke. She never cried. She spent her nights sitting on a small rug, coloring in a book with broken crayons, or stacking wooden blocks in total silence. She was like a bird in a golden cage, a tiny person living in a world of giants and guns. Do-hyun rarely looked at her, yet he never let her leave the room. She was his shadow, a quiet reminder of something he couldn't quite name. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the start of the late-night shift. Do-hyun's right-hand man, a tall soldier with a scar across his brow, entered the room and bowed low. "The docks are secure, boss," the man whispered. "The shipment is moving, but the men are nervous. They say you've become too quiet lately." Do-hyun didn't look up from his ledger. He reached for a glass of water, and as he moved, his sleeve slid up. A dark, jagged tattoo of a dragon's tail peeked out from his wrist. It was a mark of his rank, but also a shroud for the scars underneath. "Silence is a weapon," Do-hyun said, his voice deep and raspy. "Men who talk too much end up under the bridge. Tell them to do their jobs." The guard nodded and backed away, casting a nervous glance at the little girl in the corner. Everyone in the organization thought it was strange that a ruthless man like Do-hyun kept a child around. Some thought she was a lucky charm. Others thought she was a prisoner. Da-eun suddenly stopped coloring. She tilted her head as if she heard something far away. She looked at the heavy steel doors of the penthouse. Even though the room was guarded by 10 armed men in the hallway, she seemed to know that the night was about to change. Do-hyun noticed her movement. For a split second, his cold eyes softened. He looked at the girl, and then at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. He was hungry, a physical ache that felt like an old wound opening up. He picked up his phone and made a single call to a small, late-night shop. He didn't order fancy steak or expensive wine. He ordered a simple bag of cold noodles. He didn't know it yet, but that order would be the key that unlocked the door to his past. He looked back at his papers, trying to focus on his empire of blood and ink. In the corner, Da-eun started to hum a tiny, wordless tune. It was a melody that sounded like wind blowing through tall grass, a sound that didn't belong in a city of concrete. "Stop that," Do-hyun said, though his voice wasn't mean. Da-eun stopped. She went back to her blocks, but her eyes remained fixed on the door. The ghost and the little girl waited in the silence, while outside, a delivery bike sped through the rain, carrying a girl who held a secret neither of them expected. The elevator ride felt like a trip to another planet. Kim Do-eun clutched the warm brown paper bag to her chest, her heart drumming against her ribs. She was just a college student trying to pay her rent, but tonight, her GPS had led her to the tallest, darkest skyscraper in the city. The gold-plated buttons on the elevator only went up to the 50th floor. When the doors slid open with a soft chime, the air changed. It was cold, smelling of expensive cologne and old secrets. The hallway was lined with men in sharp black suits. They didn't look like guards. They looked like statues carved from shadow. Their eyes followed her every move, and she could see the heavy shapes of weapons hidden under their jackets. Da-eun swallowed hard, her throat feeling dry. She kept her head down, her old sneakers squeaking on the polished marble floor. She felt like a small gray bird that had accidentally flown into a den of wolves. "Food delivery," she whispered, her voice cracking. One of the men stepped forward. He didn't speak. He just pointed toward a set of massive double doors at the end of the hall. Da-eun took a deep breath and pushed them open. The office was huge, filled with tall bookshelves and a desk that looked like it cost more than her entire apartment. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like he was made of ice. His black hair was slicked back, and his shirt was open at the collar, showing a dark, swirling tattoo that climbed up his neck. This was Lee Do-hyun. He didn't look up when she entered. He just kept reading a file, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the wood. In the corner, Da-eun noticed a small girl sitting on the floor. The child looked lonely, her eyes wide and quiet. The sight made Da-eun feel a sudden wave of sadness. But she knew she had to finish her job and leave. She walked toward the desk, her legs feeling like lead. "I have your cold noodles, sir," she said, her voice trembling. Just as she reached the edge of the desk, her foot caught on the corner of a thick, plush rug. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Da-eun gasped as she lost her balance. She lunged forward, trying to save the bag, but her hands slipped. The paper ripped, and the plastic container hit the floor with a loud thud. The lid popped off, and the noodles spilled across the expensive carpet like a tangled mess. The room went deathly silent. Every guard in the room stiffened. Do-hyun stopped tapping his fingers. He slowly raised his head, his sharp eyes pinning Da-eun to the spot. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. Terrified and desperate to fix her mistake, Da-eun dropped to her knees. She didn't think. She didn't plan. In her blind panic, her brain reached for the oldest words she knew, the words her grandmother used to say back in their tiny, forgotten village by the sea. "Egu Samchin. Naiga Cham Maldo Andwi," she blurted out. "Gugsugie de Sigio Birayan." She wasn't speaking the standard Korean used in the city. She was speaking a rare, ancient dialect, calling him uncle in a way that only people from one specific, tiny town would understand. It was a rough, musical way of speaking that had mostly disappeared from the world. The effect was instant. Do-hyun's face, which had been as still as stone, suddenly cracked. His eyes widened, and he gripped the edges of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. For the first time in many years, the ghost looked human, and he looked absolutely terrified. The silence in the penthouse was no longer cold. It was heavy and electric. Do-hyun sat perfectly still, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The words the delivery girl had just blurted out weren't just a mistake. They were a ghost. That specific way of saying uncle, with the long, trailing vowels and the sharp rhythm, belonged to a place that shouldn't exist anymore. It belonged to a tiny village on a cliffside, a place of salty air and green hills that had been swallowed by fire 20 years ago. Do-hyun slowly stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, a sound like a scream in the quiet room. The guards moved closer, their hands hovering over their belts, waiting for him to give the signal to throw the girl out, or worse. But Do-hyun raised a single hand, stopping them in their tracks. He didn't look at his men. He only looked at Da-eun, who was still on her knees, her hands covered in cold noodle broth. "What did you just say?" Do-hyun asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it shook with a hidden fever. Da-eun looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. She realized she had spoken in her grandmother's tongue, a dialect she usually hid because city people thought it sounded uneducated. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, switching back to standard Korean. "I didn't mean to be rude. I got scared," and the words slipped out. "It's how we talk back home." Do-hyun stepped around his desk. He walked toward her until the toes of his expensive leather shoes touched the spilled noodles. He ignored the mess. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The ghost of Seoul looked like he was seeing a miracle or a nightmare. "Where is home?" he whispered. Da-eun swallowed hard. "A small place. You wouldn't know it. It was called Guriam, the village of clouds. But it's gone now. There was a terrible fire when I was very little." A chill ran down Do-hyun's spine. He felt the ink of his tattoo itch, as if the dragon on his skin wanted to crawl away. He was from that village. He was the boy who had ran through those same streets, screaming for his mother while the sky turned orange with sparks. He had spent 2 decades trying to bury that boy under layers of blood and money. He had changed his name, his face and his soul. But he couldn't change the way his heart jumped when he heard the music of his birthplace. He looked at the girl's simple jacket and her tired eyes. She was a piece of his past, standing right in front of him in his kingdom of shadows. She didn't know who he really was. She only saw a monster in a suit, But for the first time in his life, Do-hyun felt like the mask was falling off. Behind him, the little girl, Hae-in, stood up from her rug. She was watching them both with an expression that was far too old for a 6-year-old. The air in the room seemed to grow thin, as if the penthouse was floating away from the rest of the world. Do-hyun realized that this wasn't just a random delivery. Something was pulling the threads of his life back together, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth that was about to break. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it might snap. Do-hyun was still staring at the delivery girl, his mind racing through memories of smoke and salt air. The guards stood like frozen statues, their eyes darting between their boss and the mess on the floor. No one moved. No one breathed. The ghost of Seoul looked like he had seen a ghost of his own. Then, a tiny sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a shout or a cry. It was a soft, humming noise coming from the shadows near the bookshelf. Do-hyun turned his head slowly, his heart stopping in his chest. Little Hae-in, the girl who had been as silent as a stone for months, was standing up. She walked forward until she was out of the darkness and under the bright lights of the office. She wasn't looking at the guards or the expensive furniture. She was looking straight at the spilled noodles and then at Da-eun. Her small face, usually blank and tired, suddenly looked bright. Her lips parted, and a voice that was clear and sweet as a bell filled the massive room. She began to sing. The words weren't in the language of the city. They were in the same rough, rhythmic dialect that Da-eun had just used. It was a lullaby about a silver moon hiding behind a cloud and a mother waiting by the shore for the fishing boats to come home. It was the song of the sea, a melody that was only sung in one place, Gurium Mole. Do-hyun felt a cold shiver run from his neck down to his heels. His breath hitched. He knew that song. He knew every note, every rising tone, and every secret word. His mother used to sing it to him every night while she tucked him into his small bed in their wooden house. It was a song that was supposed to have died in the fire 20 years ago. It was a family secret, a private treasure that no outsider could ever know. Where? How do you know that song? Do-hyun whispered. His voice was no longer the voice of a mafia boss. It was the voice of a scared little boy. Hae-in didn't stop singing. She walked toward Do-hyun and reached out a tiny hand, touching the dark dragon tattoo on his wrist. As she sang the final line of the lullaby, she added a secret phrase, a little joke about a lazy dragon that his mother had made up just for him and his little sister. The room seemed to spin. Do-hyun's eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. He looked at the girl's round face and the small birthmark near her ear that he had never noticed before because he had been too afraid to look at her. The penthouse ghost wasn't just a random orphan he had taken in to pay a debt. The shocking truth hit him like a physical blow. The sister he had mourned for 2 decades, the one he thought had turned to ash in the flames, was standing right in front of him. She had been in his house, under his protection, and he hadn't even recognized his own blood because he had shut his heart so tight. Da-eun gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She recognized the song, too. She looked from the little girl to the powerful man in the suit and realized they were tied together by a history of fire and sea. Do-hyun dropped to his knees in the middle of the spilled food and the ruined carpet. He didn't care about his dignity or his men watching him. He reached out and wrapped his arms around the tiny girl, pulling her close. For the first time in 20 years, the ghost of Seoul let out a sob that shook his entire frame. The secret language had done the impossible. It had brought the dead back to life. Do-hyun held Hae-in so tightly it felt like he was trying to merge their souls. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a man whose entire world had just cracked open. He looked up from the little girl, his eyes red and burning with a new, dangerous light. He looked past the delivery girl and straight at the man standing by the door, his oldest advisor and right hand, Mr. Choi. Mr. Choi had been with the organization since before Do-hyun was a man. He was the one who had found Do-hyun in the ashes of the village. He was the one who had taught him how to shoot, how to lead, and how to forget his past. But as Do-hyun looked at him now, he saw something he had never noticed before, a flicker of guilt in the old man's eyes. Choi, Do-hyun said. His voice was quiet, but it sounded like the growl of a wolf. Come here. The advisor stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking on the marble. He didn't look at the little girl. He kept his eyes on the floor. Yes, boss. You told me my sister died in the fire, Do-hyun said, his voice rising. You told me you searched the rubble and found nothing but ash. You said I was the only survivor. So why is this child singing my mother's secret song? Why does she have the birthmark of my family? Mr. Choi swallowed hard. He tried to maintain his calm face, but his hands were shaking at his sides. Boss, children learn songs from many places. It must be a mistake. A coincidence. Do-hyun stood up, lifting Hae-in into his arms. He walked toward the advisor until they were chest to chest. There are no coincidences in this city, Choi. And there are no mistakes when it comes to my blood. He grabbed the advisor by the collar, pulling him close enough to smell the stale tobacco on the man's breath. Tell me the truth, or I will burn this building down with us inside it. The guards in the room shifted uncomfortably. They had never seen Do-hyun like this, unhinged and driven by love rather than cold logic. Mr. Choi's face went pale. He knew he couldn't lie his way out of this. The secret language had destroyed 20 years of deception in a single minute. It wasn't my idea, Choi whispered, his voice cracking. The old boss. He knew you were too talented to let go. He knew that if you had a family to return to, you would never become the ghost. He needed you to be alone. He needed you to be a weapon with nothing to lose. Do-hyun felt a wave of cold fury wash over him. So you took her? You watched me cry for years while she was alive? We didn't kill her, Choi said quickly, desperate to save himself. We kept her in a private orphanage. We told the staff she was a gift for the organization. When the old boss died, I brought her here as a debt payment so I could keep an eye on her. I thought it was safer if you never knew. I thought it would keep you focused on the throne. Do-hyun realized the horrible truth. His entire life as a mafia boss was a cage built out of lies. The people he trusted had stolen his sister and used her as a hidden leash to keep him loyal. They had turned his tragedy into a tool for power. He looked down at Hae-in, who was clinging to his neck. She had been a prisoner in her own home, kept in the shadows of his office so the advisor could watch them both. The right hand hadn't been protecting Do-hyun. He had been guarding a secret that would destroy the organization. You stole 20 years from us, Do-hyun said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He looked around the room at his guards. He could see the doubt in their faces. Some were loyal to him, but others were loyal to the old ways and to Mr. Choi. The web of lies was starting to unravel, and Do-hyun knew that by choosing his sister, he was declaring war on his own empire. The air in the office, which used to be silent and cold, now felt like it was boiling. Do-hyun stood in the center of the room, holding Hae-in against his chest. His eyes were no longer those of a calm businessman. They were the eyes of a brother who had just found a lost treasure. But as he looked around, he realized that his own men were watching him differently. They didn't see a powerful leader anymore. They saw a man who had a weakness. Mr. Choi backed away from Do-hyun, rubbing his neck where the boss had grabbed him. The fear in the old advisor's eyes was quickly being replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. He looked at the guards lining the walls. These were men he had hired. These were men he had paid with the organization's dirty money for years. Look at him, Mr. Choi said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The ghost is crying over a child and a delivery girl. He has forgotten who we are. He has forgotten the rules that keep us alive in this city. One by one, the guards began to unbutton their jackets. They didn't reach for their guns yet, but their hands stayed close to their holsters. The loyalty that had held the room together for years was snapping like a dry twig. To them, emotion was a disease. If the boss was sick with love, he was a danger to the business. He's compromised, one of the younger guards whispered, stepping forward. A boss who cares about a sister is a boss who can be blackmailed. He's a liability. Do-hyun felt the shift in the room. He tightened his grip on Hae-in. He knew how these men thought. In the Mafia, if you weren't a predator, you were prey. By showing his heart, he had painted a target on his back. He looked at Da-eun, the delivery girl, who was still frozen on the floor. She was a witness to everything, and in this world, witnesses didn't live long. Stand up, Da-eun, Do-hyun commanded. His voice was steady again, but it had a new edge to it, the edge of a protector. Da-eun scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking. She could see the guards closing in, forming a circle around them. The beautiful penthouse, with its view of the glowing city, had suddenly become a high-tech cage. There were only two ways out: the private elevator, which was now blocked by 3 armed men, or the service stairs behind the kitchen. Mr. Choi pulled a small radio from his pocket. Lock down the floor, he barked into it. The boss is no longer fit to lead. No one leaves until we settle this. The heavy steel doors of the office hissed shut and clicked into place. The lights flickered for a second as the security system took over. Do-hyun looked at the man he had trusted for 20 years. Mr. Choi wasn't just an advisor anymore. He was a traitor who was ready to step over Do-hyun's body to take the throne. You think you can take this from me? Do-hyun asked, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not taking it, Mr. Choi replied with a cold smile. I'm saving it. You were a great weapon, Do-hyun. But a weapon that starts to feel pain is useless. It's time for you to go back to the ashes where I found you. Hae-in buried her face in Do-hyun's shoulder. She didn't make a sound, but he could feel her trembling. He looked at the guards, then at the glass walls that showed the world below. He was outnumbered and trapped. The ghost was surrounded by his own shadows, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for a chance to finally say his sister's name out loud. The air in the office was so heavy it felt like it might crush them. Do-hyun stood in the center of the room, holding Hae-in close. The guards were slowly stepping forward, their hands resting on the grips of their guns. Mr. Choi stood by the main doors, a cruel smile on his face. He knew the elevator was locked. He knew the main stairs were guarded. He thought he had the ghost trapped in a golden cage. Da-eun stood behind Do-hyun, her heart hammering against her chest like a trapped bird. She was just a delivery girl. A girl who usually spent her nights worrying about grades and tips. But as she looked at the cold, hard faces of the men in the black suits, she realized something they didn't. These men only knew the front of the building. They knew the marble floors and the shiny glass. They didn't know the hidden world of the people who kept the building running. Sir, Da-eun whispered, leaning close to Do-hyun's ear. The service hall. Behind the kitchen. Do-hyun didn't move his head, but his eyes shifted toward her. The guards are everywhere, Da-eun. There is no way out. There is, she insisted, her voice trembling but brave. I've been making deliveries here for 3 months. The main elevator is for the bosses, but the service elevator is for the trash and the food. It's behind a false wall in the pantry. They don't use it at night because the sensors are broken. If we can get past that kitchen door, we can disappear. Do-hyun glanced at the heavy wooden door to the left. He hadn't stepped into that kitchen in 5 years. To him, food just appeared on his desk. He had forgotten that every palace has a back door for the servants. Suddenly, Mr. Choi lost his patience. Enough talk. Take the girl and put the boss in the holding room. If he resists, use your weapons. The guards lunged forward. Do-hyun reacted like a coiled spring. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he grabbed a heavy glass carafe from his desk and hurled it at the nearest guard. As the glass shattered and the man went down, Do-hyun grabbed Da-eun's hand. Run, he roared. They sprinted toward the kitchen. The guards were surprised by the sudden movement. Bullets began to fly, shattering the expensive bookshelves and sending bits of paper flying through the air like snow. Do-hyun shielded Hae-in with his own body, his large frame acting as a wall of muscle and ink. They burst through the swinging kitchen doors. The room was dark and smelled of stainless steel and soap. Da-eun didn't hesitate. She led them past the giant refrigerators and toward a small, narrow hallway piled high with empty crates. At the very end was a door that looked like a broom closet. In here, she cried. She pulled a heavy latch, and the wall groaned as it slid open. Behind it was a small, grimy elevator used for moving heavy bags of laundry and trash. It was cramped and smelled of old rain, but it was a way out. They scrambled inside just as the kitchen doors burst open again. The guards were shouting, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Da-eun slammed the gate shut and punched a button that had no label. The elevator lurched, groaning as it began to drop. For a moment, they were in total darkness. The sounds of the shouting men faded away, replaced by the mechanical hum of the cables. Do-hyun leaned against the metal wall, breathing hard. He looked at Da-eun, who was shaking so hard she had to lean on the trash bins for support. She was just an ordinary girl, but she had just saved the most dangerous man in Seoul. Why did you help us? Do-hyun asked, his voice soft in the dark. You could have just run away. Da-eun looked at little Hae-in, who was still clinging to Do-hyun's neck. Because she sang the song, Da-eun said simply. In our village, we never leave family behind, even if we've forgotten who they are. The elevator reached the basement with a heavy thud. The doors opened to a rainy alleyway, far away from the polished marble and the men with guns. They stepped out into the cold night air, the neon lights of the city reflecting in the puddles. They were safe for now. But Do-hyun knew the war was only just beginning. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, turning the alleyway into a river of dark water. The neon signs of the city blurred into streaks of blue and red. Do-hyun stood by the rusting service elevator, his expensive suit soaked through and clinging to his skin. He tucked Hae-in behind a stack of wooden crates, and Da-eun crouched beside her, shielding the little girl from the wind. "Stay here," Do-hyun whispered. His voice was no longer the cold command of a boss. It was the steady, quiet promise of a brother. The heavy steel door of the basement burst open. "Mr." Choi stepped out into the rain, followed by 4 guards. They held their guns out, the metal glinting under the dim streetlights. "Mr." Choi looked around the dirty alley with disgust, his polished shoes splashing in a puddle of oily water. "It's over, Do-hyun," Choi shouted over the roar of the storm. "You're standing in the trash where you belong. Give me the girl, and maybe I'll let you walk away with your life. You can go back to being a ghost." Do-hyun didn't move. He slowly reached up and unbuttoned his soaked suit jacket, letting it fall into the mud. Then, he began to unbutton his white shirt. He pulled it off, throwing it aside. In the flickering light of the alley, his massive dragon tattoo seemed to come alive. The dark ink covered his chest and arms, a symbol of the violence he had lived for 20 years. "For a long time, I thought this ink was who I was," Do-hyun said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "I thought I had to be a monster to keep what I had. But you didn't give me this power, Choi. You stole my life and gave me a cage instead." The guards moved in, forming a semicircle. They were nervous. They had seen Do-hyun fight before, but never like this. He looked different. The ghost was gone, and in his place was a man who had everything to lose. "Take him," Choi barked. The first guard lunged forward, swinging the butt of his gun. Do-hyun ducked under the blow with lightning speed. He didn't use a weapon. He used his bare hands, striking with the strength of someone who was finally breaking free. He disarmed the first man and sent him spinning into a pile of trash cans with a single, powerful kick. The other guards fired their weapons, but the rain and the shadows made it hard to aim. Do-hyun moved like a blur through the storm. He wasn't fighting for a throne or for money anymore. Every punch he threw was for the 20 years he had spent alone. Every time he dodged a bullet, he was moving closer to the sister he had thought was dead. He reached the last 2 guards near a parked delivery truck. They tried to grab him, but Do-hyun gripped their collars and slammed them together with a thud that echoed through the alley. They fell to the wet pavement, groaning. Finally, it was just Do-hyun and Mr. Choi. The advisor pulled a small silver pistol from his pocket, his hand shaking. "You're nothing without the organization, Do-hyun. You're just a boy from a village that doesn't exist." Do-hyun walked toward him, ignoring the gun pointed at his chest. The rain washed over his tattoo, and for the first time, the dragon didn't look scary. It looked like a shield. "The village exists as long as we remember it," Do-hyun said. He reached out and easily twisted the gun from Choi's trembling hand. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he dropped the weapon into the sewer grate. He looked Choi in the eye, the man who had lied to him for 2 decades, and simply turned his back. "I'm not a boss anymore," Do-hyun said, "and you're not worth my time." He walked back to the crates where the girls were hiding. Da-eun looked at him with wide, amazed eyes. She saw the blood on his knuckles and the ink on his skin, but she also saw the way he reached out to pick up Hae-in with total gentleness. He didn't look like a king of the underworld. He looked like a man who had finally come home. He wrapped his arms around his sister, shielding her from the cold rain, and led them toward the end of the alley. The dragon on his back was just ink now. The real strength was in his heart. The sound of the city was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the ocean. A few weeks had passed since the night in the rain. Now, the only lights came from a few distant fishing boats and the warm glow of a small wooden shack perched on a cliffside. It was a simple place with peeling white paint and a roof that leaked a little when it rained, but to Do-hyun, it felt more solid than any skyscraper in Seoul. Inside the shack, the air smelled of salt and toasted seaweed. Do-hyun sat on the floor, wearing a plain gray sweatshirt that hid his tattoos. He wasn't looking at bank statements or maps of territory. He was watching Da-eun stir a pot of soup over a small stove. She had stayed with them, helping Hae-in adjust to a world where she didn't have to hide in the shadows of a mahogany desk. Hae-in sat between them, her lap filled with bright, new crayons. She wasn't coloring in silence anymore. She was humming the song of the sea, her voice small but steady. Every now and then, she would look up at Do-hyun and smile. A tiny expression that made his heart feel like it was finally beginning to thaw after a long, bitter winter. The transition hadn't been easy. Do-hyun had given up everything, his money, his power, and his reputation. He had left the ghost behind in the city, buried under the weight of his own lies. He was starting over with almost nothing, but as he looked at his sister, he realized he had never been richer. "The soup is ready," Da-eun said, her voice bright. She set 3 bowls on the low wooden table. "It's not as fancy as the food in the penthouse, but it's warm." Do-hyun picked up his spoon, but he didn't eat right away. He looked at Hae-in, who was waiting for him to start. He took a deep breath. For 20 years, his voice had been a tool for fear. He had used it to give orders, to threaten enemies, and to build a wall around himself. He had spoken the language of the city, a cold and sharp version of Korean that had no room for love. He looked at the window, where the moon was reflecting off the waves, just like in the lullaby. He turned to Hae-in and spoke. He didn't use the formal, stiff words of a boss. He spoke in the rough, musical dialect of Guriam-mul, the language of the clouds and the sea. "Mani miyajira, ne dongsung," he said softly. "Eat a lot, my little sister." The words felt strange in his throat, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. It wasn't a command, it was a gift. It was the sound of a brother caring for his family. It was the sound of home. Hae-in's eyes lit up. She nodded and began to eat, her face glowing in the candlelight. Da-eun smiled, a tear pricking the corner of her eye. She knew that in this small shack, the war was truly over. Do-hyun looked out at the dark water. He knew that the world might still be a dangerous place, and his past might try to find him one day. But as he sat there, speaking his heart in the language he had once been forced to forget, he knew he was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a name, a sister, and a future. The ghost of Seoul was dead, but Lee Do-hyun was finally, truly alive.